Newport Mansion on Bellevue Avenue still stands with its polished marble front and flawless gardens, but few dare to mention its name. Beneath all that beauty lies a story so dark that 3 generations of Rhode Island families worked to keep it hidden. Between 1861 and 1863, 7 men met mysterious deaths inside those walls. Each was tied to the same woman, and each suffered the same dreadful signs: violent shaking, blackened nails, and that bitter almond smell no one could mistake for anything but arsenic. What makes this tale even more chilling is not just the calculated murders, but the discovery made decades later in a locked courthouse cellar. The killer wasn't acting alone. Some of her victims' own relatives were helping her, even as she poisoned them. Before we dive deeper into the twisted story of Margaret Aldridge and the Newport poisoning ring, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell, because this is the kind of history wealthy families buried and textbooks erased. Drop a comment telling us what state you're tuning in from. Viewers who visited these places often share insights that bring even more depth to these forgotten crimes. The truth about the mansion finally surfaced in 1924, when construction workers stumbled on a hidden compartment behind the library walls. Inside were papers that rewrote everything historians thought they knew about one of Newport's most respected families. Back in the spring of 1861, Newport was a city split in 2. While the North braced for war with the Confederacy, Newport's upper class was basking in an age of luxury. Fortunes made from mills, shipping, and global trade had turned this seaside town into a playground for America's richest. Along Bellevue Avenue, mansions rose like monuments to wealth rivaling Europe's grandest palaces. Among them was Ravenscroft Manor, the Aldridge estate, with 40 rooms of Italian marble, French crystal, and Caribbean mahogany. Perched with a sweeping view of the Atlantic, the house glittered in the morning sun like golden eyes keeping watch over the coast. At its center was Margaret Aldridge, a formidable figure at 47. Widowed 3 years earlier after her husband Edmund supposedly died in a riding accident, she now controlled the vast family fortune with a sharpness that stunned Newport's male-dominated society. Many admitted reluctantly that Edmund's death had revealed his wife to be far more capable than anyone had imagined. Margaret wasn't praised for beauty, but for presence. Tall and slender, with cold gray eyes that seemed to weigh every person and object in her path, she carried herself with an authority that demanded attention. Her dark hair, streaked with early silver, was always perfectly styled, and she dressed in rich but somber shades of blue and black that set off her pale complexion and gave her an air of mystery men found both haunting and magnetic. Margaret's daughters embodied the future she was determined to protect. Eleanor, at 23, fit the mold of a refined young lady, perfectly graceful, beautiful, and well-mannered, the sort who never lacked for suitors among Newport's privileged young men. Her younger sister Catherine, just 21, had a sharper edge. Clever and outspoken, she often worried her mother, who valued quiet compliance over bold opinions in daughters expected to marry well. The Aldridge fortune was impressive, but far from unshakable. Edmund's missteps in business before his untimely death had already strained their wealth, and the looming war threatened to disrupt the shipping lines that kept their coffers full. Margaret knew her daughters' marriages were more than personal unions. They were lifelines. The right husbands could secure the Aldridges standing for generations, while the wrong choices could send everything crumbling. So when Eleanor became engaged to Charles Whitfield, a 26-year-old from a prominent Boston family, it seemed like fate had smiled on them. Charles had everything Margaret wanted, a generous inheritance. Northern textile wealth, Harvard education, polished manners, and political connections that promised a brilliant future. Tall, broad-shouldered, and effortlessly confident, he appeared the very definition of a young man destined for greatness. Newport society buzzed when the engagement was announced in February 1861, hailing it as a perfect match. Charles adored Eleanor, showering her with letters brimming with poetry and oaths of eternal love. Eleanor, more reserved, seemed quietly content, and the June wedding was anticipated with excitement across the city's elite circles. Margaret poured herself into the preparations, personally selecting the finest fabrics for her daughter's gown and dictating every detail of the ceremony. She welcomed Charles into Ravenscroft Manor for long visits, claiming she wanted to know her future son-in-law better. But her real motives were far more dangerous than motherly interest. From the very first moment, Charles had stirred something in Margaret that went far beyond affection. Love was not in her nature, at least not in the tender sense. What she felt was the thrill of pursuit, the satisfaction of spotting a man who was not only desirable, but useful. Charles was more than a son-in-law. He was an opportunity, perhaps the solution to every financial strain threatening the Aldridge legacy. By April, as Charles spent nearly a week at the estate under the guise of finalizing legal matters, the cracks in the polished surface began to show. On one warm evening, the house followed its routine. Eleanor at the piano, Catherine absorbed in a book, servants tidying after dinner. Margaret slipped out to the terrace and found Charles alone, cigarette in hand, gazing at the Atlantic's restless waves hammering the rocks. That moment marked the beginning of something no one in Newport society could have imagined. The moon hung nearly full over the ocean, washing the terrace in silver light and making the whole moment feel like a staged performance. Margaret glided toward Charles with deliberate grace, carrying 2 glasses of brandy, the silk of her evening gown shimmering as it caught the glow. She handed him a glass with a knowing smile. "You look troubled, Charles. Surely not about marrying my daughter." He accepted it gratefully, though the closeness of her presence unsettled him. There was something in her gaze, in the way she lingered just inside the boundaries of propriety, that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Not troubled," he said, after a pause, sipping the brandy. "Just thinking about the future, the way life is bound to change. Feels like we're all in a dream that could end any moment." Margaret stepped closer, her perfume drifting between them. "Dreams can be dangerous," she murmured. "They distract us from what matters. Sometimes the most valuable things in life are standing right in front of us." For the next hour, she steered the conversation with practiced skill, drawing out his doubts about his career, his insecurities about Eleanor, even his concerns about finances. With every confession, Margaret positioned herself as the only person who truly understood him. What Charles didn't know was that she had been preparing for this moment, studying his letters, his habits, his vulnerabilities. She had even begun slipping mild sedatives into his nightly brandy. Nothing harmful, just enough to lower his guard and soften his resolve. That night she began her campaign with the subtlest of moves. A lingering touch on his arm. A laugh that held just a trace, too much warmth. A compliment that seemed to carry a second meaning. The combination of her presence, her words, and the drugged brandy left Charles adrift, torn between propriety and a rising tide of forbidden desire. "You're not what I expected," he admitted, his speech slightly thick. "When Eleanor spoke of her mother, I imagined someone different, more conventional." Margaret's gray eyes locked onto his, sharp and unrelenting. "And what do you think of me now?" Charles faltered, struggling to sound proper, even as his pulse quickened. "I think Eleanor is fortunate," he said at last, "to have learned grace and intelligence from such a remarkable woman." Margaret leaned closer, her breath warm against his neck as she whispered, "Some lessons can't be taught by words alone, Charles. Some education must be experienced." But she did not push further. Margaret was too cunning to risk rushing the seduction. Instead, she withdrew just as he wavered on the edge, leaving him caught between guilt and yearning, confused by how deeply he now felt drawn to her. Inside the house, Eleanor's piano echoed faintly through the hallways, her music shielding her from the terrace's charged undercurrents. Catherine, reading in the library, noticed only that Charles seemed restless when he returned, his agitation brushed off as wedding nerves. Neither daughter had the faintest idea that their mother had already begun unraveling the threads of a deadly game. The servants, trained to fade into the background and never repeat what they overheard, noticed nothing unusual in a household buzzing with wedding preparations. But Sarah Connolly, Margaret's sharp-eyed maid, who had served her faithfully for 15 years, caught something that unsettled her. As she brushed out her mistress's hair that night, she saw Margaret studying her reflection with a satisfaction that felt out of place for a woman whose daughter's wedding was weeks away. "You seem pleased with the evening, ma'am," Sarah said cautiously. Margaret's smile in the mirror wasn't warm or motherly. It was cold, deliberate, the smile of a predator who had just locked eyes on her quarry. "Yes, Sarah," she answered, dragging the brush slowly through her dark hair. "Everything is unfolding exactly as it should." The following morning, Ravenscroft Manor received an unexpected visitor. Dr. William Hensley, the family's long-trusted physician, arrived with a somber expression. At 62, his lined face and weary eyes spoke of decades spent at sickbeds and gravesides. But never had he looked more uncomfortable than when Margaret welcomed him into her study. After a pause, he accepted the tea she offered, though his reluctance was obvious. "Margaret," he began quietly, "I've come because of troubling rumors making their way through Newport's medical circles. Rumors I had hoped would never surface." Margaret's face remained unreadable as she set her cup on its saucer, though her hand quivered just enough for Sarah, watching from the corner, to notice. "Rumors about what exactly?" she asked evenly. "About Edmund's death," Dr. Hensley said, lowering his voice further. His convulsions, his stomach distressed, the discoloration in his nails. "At the time, I assumed they were consequences of his fall from the horse. But others have suggested his symptoms matched poisoning more closely than injury." Margaret's gray eyes hardened, but her tone never wavered. "Dr. Hensley, surely you aren't implying my husband was murdered? And if so, by whom? For what possible reason?" "I'm not implying anything," he replied quickly, shifting in his chair. "I only want you to understand that questions are being asked. If they reach the wrong ears, it could become very difficult for your family." What Hensley did not reveal was the source of these whispers. They hadn't come from Newport's idle gossips, but from Charles Whitfield himself. At a dinner party the week before, Charles had casually mentioned Edmund's death to Dr. James Morrison, a Boston physician with expertise in suspicious poisonings. Morrison's pointed questions drew out details Charles barely thought twice about, until the doctor grew visibly uneasy. Morrison later shared his concerns with colleagues in Newport, and the embers of suspicion began to spread. For Charles, the curiosity wasn't born from distrust of Margaret, but from habit. Trained in law and reviewing the Aldridge family's documents for the marriage contracts, he had noticed irregularities in Edmund's will, and life insurance changes in timing that didn't quite add up. What began as due diligence for his future marriage had inadvertently opened a door into a darker truth than he could have imagined. Edmund's estate had been rewritten in the final months of his life in ways no one could ignore, documents that shifted nearly all control to Margaret, giving her unprecedented command over the Aldridge fortune. When Dr. Hensley voiced his concerns, Margaret thanked him graciously and assured him she would welcome any investigation that cleared her husband's name. But once he left, she lingered alone in her study, staring at the churning Atlantic as calculations whirred in her mind. She had always known suspicion might one day return, yet she hadn't expected the danger to come from Charles Whitfield himself. That evening, she resolved to change the rules entirely. No longer would she simply kill when cornered as she had with Edmund. From now on, she would orchestrate everything with precision, eliminating threats before they could bloom. and using her enemies' strengths against them. Charles's inquiries proved he was sharper and far more dangerous than she first imagined. But that sharpness, she realized, could be turned into an asset. Her plan was audacious and terrifying in its scope: seduce Charles, ensnare him, and use his legal mind to design the perfect series of accidents that would secure the Aldridge fortune forever. Even her daughters, if they became obstacles, would not be spared. That night, as the household slept, Margaret moved silently through the halls to Charles's guest room. She had laced his evening brandy with a stronger dose than usual, leaving him in a fog of confusion, arousal, and weakness when she slipped inside. What transpired over those hours tied Charles to her in ways that ensured retreat was no longer possible. Years later, when hidden documents were uncovered in 1924 among them, lay Charles's own handwritten confession, sealed in an envelope marked to be opened only upon my death. The contents were so damning that investigators debated destroying them outright rather than preserve evidence of what he described as his first night with Margaret Aldridge. If this story chills you as much as it did us, don't forget to like and share. It's the kind of truth wealthy families spent generations burying. Down the hall, Eleanor slept soundly, blissfully unaware that her fiancé's betrayal went far beyond unfaithfulness. Charles was no longer just a man straying before marriage. He was now bound to her mother by a secret of blood and lust that would ultimately ruin them all. Over the next days, the change in Charles was subtle, but undeniable. To Eleanor, he seemed distracted, his smile a shade too forced, his eyes carrying a restless intensity she could not explain. Catherine, ever the sharper of the sisters, noticed even more the way Charles sought out Margaret constantly, how they lingered together in the library, speaking in whispers, seated far closer than propriety allowed. When she pointed it out, Eleanor dismissed it as natural. What future son-in-law wouldn't want a good relationship with his bride's mother? What neither sister could possibly imagine was that those hushed conversations were no ordinary family bonding. Margaret had drawn Charles into her orbit completely, sharing not just her bed, but her darkest secrets, and with them, a conspiracy so monstrous it would stain them both forever. Margaret revealed everything with the precision of a stage actress, shaping the truth into a performance Charles could not resist believing. She spoke of Edmund's murder, not as an act of greed, but of survival of a desperate wife cornered by a cruel man who had plotted to divorce her and leave her and her daughters destitute. The forged papers, the staged accident, the sudden wealth of her widowhood, she framed them as the last resort of a woman fighting to protect her children. Sitting across from Charles in one of their clandestine meetings, she let tears fall at just the right moment, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I never wanted to be this kind of person." But when a mother must choose between saving her daughter's future and saving her soul, is there really a choice at all? Charles, torn by his affair with her and racked with guilt over betraying, Eleanor found himself entangled in Margaret's carefully woven net of sympathy and manipulation. She blurred the line between confession and justification so seamlessly that he began to believe he was not aiding a murderer, but shielding Eleanor and Catherine from scandal and ruin. In his mind, he was not Margaret's accomplice, he was their protector. The first task she set for him seemed harmless enough. Using his legal skills, he was to comb through the family's estate documents, checking for weaknesses that might expose them to outside claims. Charles threw himself into the work with relief, grateful for a distraction from his own guilty conscience. But the deeper he read, the more troubling the story became. The paper trail was undeniable. Edmund's death had been preceded by a series of suspiciously timed changes to wills, insurance policies, and property deeds that all but guaranteed Margaret's financial security. And Edmund wasn't the only case. Charles uncovered echoes of the same pattern in two earlier deaths tied to the Aldridges. Margaret's first husband, who had supposedly drowned in a boating accident decades earlier, had left behind similarly altered documents. Even more chilling was what Charles found about Thomas Richardson, Eleanor's former fiancé, and a man Charles had known at Harvard. Healthy, athletic, and a skilled horseman, Thomas's sudden death in a carriage accident had never quite made sense. His horses had bolted on a calm evening, leading to a violent crash that snapped his neck. For those who knew him, the explanation never fit. For Charles, who now recognized the signs, the truth was impossible to ignore. When he confronted Margaret with his findings, expecting denial or horror, she met him with calm certainty. Yes, Thomas had begun to suspect the truth about Edmund, and yes, she had acted before he could expose her. As for the others, she insisted those had been genuine accidents that only looked suspicious to the untrained eye. Then, placing a hand on Charles's arm, with the practiced intimacy that now bound him to her, she said, "You see why I need you. With your intelligence, your legal training, no one else ever has to die. No more accidents will be necessary if you help me protect what we've built. With your help, we can secure the family's future without anyone else getting hurt." Margaret's words echoed in Charles's head long after she'd spoken them. To his horror, a part of him found her ruthless pragmatism compelling. She wasn't deranged, nor was she driven by cruelty. She operated like a commander charting a battle plan, removing obstacles with precision for the sake of survival. And though his conscience screamed, Charles began to rationalize her crimes as necessary evils, convincing himself that protecting Eleanor and Catherine from scandal justified his silence. The final snare of Margaret's trap came when she unveiled her latest scheme. With a look of maternal sorrow, she confided that Eleanor had been asking too many questions about Thomas Richardson's suspicious death. Worse, she had begun corresponding with relatives in Boston who might uncover the pattern of accidents shadowing the Aldridge name. "I love my daughter," Margaret said, tears shimmering with perfect timing. "But she doesn't understand how dangerous the truth can be. If she keeps pulling at threads, she will destroy herself and bring ruin on all of us, including you, Charles. Your career, your reputation gone forever." Then came the solution, chilling in its elegance. Eleanor, she explained, would need to suffer a tragic accident before her curiosity doomed them all. It would be a loss too dreadful to bear. But Catherine was still young enough to rebuild her life elsewhere, safely removed from the scandal. Charles should have recoiled, should have fled Ravenscroft Manor and exposed everything. Instead, he caught himself asking about timing and methods with the same tone he used when reviewing legal documents. The shift was complete. The honorable young man who had come to Newport with dreams of marriage and a bright future had been twisted into Margaret Aldridge's accomplice, preparing to betray and destroy the very woman he had sworn to protect. Eleanor's first clear suspicion struck on a dreary morning in May. She descended to the wine cellar to find her mother and Charles huddled together examining a dusty bottle. Their conversation stopped the instant she appeared, both of them wearing the startled expressions of conspirators caught mid-plot. "We were just choosing wine for tonight's dinner," Margaret explained smoothly, though the bottle was no longer in their hands. "Charles has developed quite the appreciation for our cellar." Eleanor smiled, pretending to believe her, but something gnawed at her. The bottle they'd been holding was one of the oldest vintages, one her mother rarely touched. And just before she'd entered, Eleanor could have sworn she saw Charles slip something small into his jacket pocket. That evening at dinner, she watched more carefully. Every glance, every word between her mother and her fiancé carried a tension she could no longer ignore. Their exchanges were practiced intimate, the kind of coded communication that comes from shared secrets. For the first time, Eleanor wondered not if something was wrong, but just how deep the wrongness went. At dinner, Eleanor had noticed every subtle gesture, the way Margaret's fingers brushed Charles's hand as she passed the salt. The knowing glance they shared over harmless conversation, the way Charles seemed utterly spellbound by her mother's every word. But when Eleanor mentioned receiving a letter from Thomas Richardson's sister in Boston asking about the strange circumstances of his death, the mask slipped. Margaret's fork froze midway to her lips, and Charles's wine glass slipped from his fingers, crimson liquid bleeding across the white linen like a wound. "How clumsy of me." Charles stammered, his voice tight as he fumbled for a napkin. "I can't imagine why Miss Richardson would be asking such questions after all this time." Margaret's voice was calm, but measured as she added, "Grief affects people differently. Some people cannot accept that accidents are simply accidents. They need someone to blame." Eleanor studied her mother carefully. Margaret's tone was smooth, her features perfectly composed, but her eyes betrayed something Eleanor had never seen before. A cold, calculating gleam that sent a chill down her spine. That night, lying awake in her room, Eleanor resolved to uncover the truth for herself. If Thomas's sister still harbored suspicions, perhaps Thomas had left behind something, notes, evidence that explained why his accident had never felt right. The following evening, Eleanor climbed to the mansion's dusty attic where Thomas's belongings had been stored since his death. With trembling hands, she opened the trunk, finding a leather portfolio hidden beneath neatly folded clothes. What she read inside drained the blood from her face. Thomas had been investigating her father's death. His notes detailed Edmund's symptoms, convulsions, stomach distress, blackened nails, and questioned the plausibility of a simple riding accident. He had even gathered statements from servants who recalled odd behavior from Margaret in those final days. At the bottom of the portfolio, Eleanor found a draft letter to the Newport police chief dated just 3 days before Thomas's fatal carriage crash. In it, Thomas outlined his suspicions in painstaking detail and called for a formal inquiry into Edmund's death. Sitting in the flickering light of a single attic lamp, Eleanor felt the world collapse around her. The man she had once loved had been killed because he knew the truth. And now, with Charles's strange closeness to Margaret and their obvious unease at dinner, she realized she too was ensnared in the same pattern. Her engagement wasn't protection, it was a trap. The creak of footsteps on the attic stairs jolted her upright. Heart hammering, she stuffed the portfolio beneath her skirt and hurriedly rearranged the clothes to look as though she had been sifting through them out of sentiment. When the lamp's glow reached the top step, her worst fear materialized. Margaret stood there, her expression softened into maternal concern, though Eleanor now recognized it as nothing more than a mask. "My dear, what are you doing up here so late?" she asked in a voice gentle enough to lull a child. Yet her eyes scanned the scene with sharp calculation. "Surely it isn't healthy to dwell on such sad memories." "I was just remembering," Eleanor managed, her voice unsteady, but steady enough to pass. She clutched the hidden portfolio against her leg, praying her mother couldn't hear the pounding of her heart. Eleanor forced a polite smile as she told her mother she was only trying to find something that might comfort Miss Richardson. But her pulse was thundering in her ears. Margaret's perfume carried that faint, bitter undertone she couldn't quite place until later. "That's very thoughtful of you," Margaret said, her tone sweet on the surface, but edged with steel. "But I fear stirring up old grief may do more harm than good. Some wounds heal better when left undisturbed." The deliberate weight she put on the word undisturbed made Eleanor's stomach twist. It wasn't advice, it was a warning. For the first time, Eleanor saw her mother clearly. The woman who had raised her was gone, replaced by someone cold, calculating, and deadly. "Of course, Mother," she said with a strained smile, playing the part of the obedient daughter. "You're right. I should focus on the future and let the past rest." Margaret's answering smile looked maternal, but her eyes betrayed her sharp, watchful, full of hidden intent. "Exactly, my dear." Your wedding is only weeks away. That is what should concern you now." As Margaret turned to leave, fate intervened. A small glass vial slipped from her pocket and rolled across the attic floor, stopping at Eleanor's feet. The label read in Margaret's careful script, "For headaches, use sparingly." Eleanor had seen such bottles all her life, her mother forever claiming them as medicine for her chronic pain. But when she picked it up, the bitter scent hit her with terrible clarity. It was the same odor that had filled the air during her father's final illness. The same scent that lingered in the days before Thomas Richardson's accident. The white powder inside wasn't medicine. It was arsenic. The truth settled like ice in Eleanor's veins. Her mother was a murderess. Edmund's death, Thomas's accident, none of it had been fate. And now Eleanor realized she was living inside a house where her own survival was no longer guaranteed. Who would Margaret target next? Logic suggested Charles was safe. He was Margaret's co-conspirator. But Eleanor could not know that Margaret had already decided Charles knew too much. Both he and Eleanor were now marked their lives measured in borrowed hours. Arsenic was the perfect weapon in 1861, sold freely as rat poison, easily folded into food or drink, and subtle enough to mimic natural illness when administered in small doses. Margaret's genius wasn't just her choice of poison, but her patience. She had already begun testing her victims, sprinkling just enough into their meals to study the effects. Eleanor's persistent headaches over the past week, which she had blamed on wedding stress, were now horrifyingly clear. They were the first symptoms of arsenic poisoning. For the next 3 days, Eleanor lived in a state of quiet terror, forcing herself to behave normally while planning her survival. She began dodging meals, claiming her nerves made it impossible to eat, but her evasions could only last so long. One slip, one misstep, and the glass of wine or plate of food before her might be the one that finished her. Eleanor never let Thomas Richardson's leather portfolio out of her sight. She carried it everywhere, pressed against her body beneath her clothing, the only shield she had if she needed to prove what her mother truly was. The night of May 15th, 1861, exactly 1 month before her wedding, would become the turning point. That evening, she discovered Margaret and Charles in the wine cellar again, their voices drifting up the stone stairwell. This time, she didn't interrupt. She hid in the shadows, clutching the cold wall, and listened. "The dosage needs to be increased," Margaret said, her tone brisk and clinical, as if she were discussing household accounts. "Eleanor is showing resistance, and we cannot afford to let this drag on much longer. The wedding is in 4 weeks. She must be incapacitated before then." Charles's reply was strangled with guilt. "Margaret, I can't. Watching her suffer, knowing what we're doing, it's tearing me apart. There has to be another way." "There is no other way." Margaret snapped, her voice cutting like steel. "Eleanor has seen too much. She knows too much. If you hadn't been so careless with those documents, we wouldn't be in this position. Your sudden attack of conscience is touching, but it is far too late for second thoughts." "What about Catherine?" Charles asked, his voice barely audible. "She's been asking questions too." Margaret's laugh echoed through the cellar, sharp and cruel. "Catherine will be devastated, of course. Her sister's tragic illness will crush her spirit. So crushed that she'll need to leave Newport to recover. I'm thinking a sanatorium in the mountains. Remote, isolated, where the air is thin and accidents happen all the time." Eleanor pressed herself tighter against the wall, fighting the urge to cry out. Her mother wasn't simply planning her death. Catherine was next. Then Charles whispered the question that made Eleanor's blood freeze. "And after Eleanor and Catherine are gone, what happens to us?" Silence broken by the faint rustle of silk as Margaret moved closer. "We'll be free, Charles. She breathed, her voice low and intoxicating. Free to be together, free to enjoy the life we've built. Imagine it all of Newport society believing we turn to each other for comfort after losing poor Eleanor. Why, it's almost romantic. What Margaret didn't say, but Eleanor now understood, was that Charles himself was already marked. Margaret had no intention of sharing power with a man too weak and guilt-ridden to keep her secrets. He would serve his purpose for a time, and then he too would meet with a tragic accident. In the end, Margaret would inherit not only the Aldridge fortune, but the Whitfield wealth as well. Eleanor had heard enough. Her body trembled as she slipped back up the staircase, every step fueled by terror and clarity. Escape was no longer optional. It was survival. She had to leave Ravenscroft Manor, warn Catherine, and find allies willing to confront her mother's crimes. The portfolio was crucial, but paper alone would never be enough. She needed witnesses, protection, and above all, time. The sudden echo of footsteps rising from the cellar jolted her into motion. Someone was coming. She clutched Thomas's evidence tighter against her body and fled into the darkened halls. Above her mind racing with a single thought, if she hesitated even once, she would not live to see morning. Eleanor's breath came in sharp bursts as she urged her horse forward, the cold night air stinging her face. Catherine rode just behind her, clutching the reins with white knuckles, both of them knowing their lives hung on every pounding stride. Behind them, Ravenscroft Manor roared to life, lanterns flaring in the windows. Servants shouting in confusion, and the distant furious cries of Margaret echoing across the grounds. Somewhere in that chaos was Charles' lantern in one hand, weapon in the other, ready to hunt them down. The sisters thundered through the iron gates and onto the moonlit road, the sound of their horseshoes striking stone like gunshots in the silence of the night. Every shadow felt like a threat, every gust of wind like a hand reaching to drag them back. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death. Eleanor clutched Thomas's portfolio tightly against her body, its weight reminding her that she wasn't just fleeing for herself or for Catherine, she was carrying the truth proof of their mother's crimes. The ride into Newport was a blur of fear and determination. Trees whipped past in the silvery light, the hooves of their pursuers growing louder in the distance. Charles knew these roads as well as they did, and Margaret's fury would drive her until dawn, if need be. Catherine glanced over her shoulder, her face pale but resolute. "They're gaining," she shouted over the wind. Eleanor's answer was to lean low over her horse's neck and urge it faster. By the time the lamps of Newport's town center came into view, Eleanor felt her strength falter, but adrenaline pushed her onward. The cobbled streets were quiet at that late hour, but the sisters did not hesitate. They galloped straight for the sheriff's office, dismounting so quickly that Catherine nearly fell to the ground. Eleanor banged on the door with her fists, her voice breaking as she cried for help. When the door opened and a weary deputy appeared, the two young women stumbled inside, breathless, disheveled, their gowns torn from the frantic ride. Eleanor thrust the portfolio into his hands. "My father was murdered," she gasped. "And my mother will kill us if you send us back. Please, you must listen. The proof is in those papers." Behind them on the dark road leading into town, lanterns bobbed in the distance. Margaret and Charles were still coming. The sisters had made it to safety for the moment, but the confrontation that awaited would decide whether their escape had been in vain, or whether the name Aldridge would finally be dragged into the light of justice. The sisters' frantic ride through the moonlit countryside became a race against death itself. Eleanor clutched the reins tight, her voice hoarse as she shouted over the pounding hooves. "If something happens to me, make sure this reaches the authorities." She shoved Thomas Richardson's leather portfolio into Catherine's arms. It's all in there. Father's murder, Thomas's investigation, everything. Catherine's face hardened with resolve as she tucked the evidence against her chest. Nothing is going to happen to either of us, she shot back, though her eyes flicked nervously to the riders gaining in the distance. We're going to survive this, and we'll see Margaret hang for what she's done. But their courage could not hide the truth. Margaret and Charles had rallied the pursuit faster than the sisters expected. Their pursuers' horses, fresher and stronger, were narrowing the gap with every thundering stride. The chase ended in a storm of shouting and hoofbeats as Eleanor and Catherine burst into Newport's town square at full gallop, screaming for help. Lanterns flickered to life, windows flew open, and townsfolk spilled into the streets. The night constable came running pistol in hand, startled by the sight of two terrified young women in torn gowns riding like fugitives. Their story sounded impossible, too wild, too scandalous to believe. On any other night, they might have been dismissed as hysterical girls inventing monsters where none existed. But the portfolio changed everything. The pages of Thomas Richardson's meticulous notes, his half-finished letter to the police chief, and the sisters' desperate detailed accusations gave the authorities pause. When Margaret and Charles arrived moments later, breathless and disheveled from their furious ride, the scene no longer looked like fantasy. It looked like pursuit. Dr. Hensley, roused from his bed and summoned to examine the evidence, confirmed that the medical notes describing Edmund Aldridge's convulsions, blackened nails, and lingering agony matched the symptoms of arsenic poisoning. He admitted with heavy guilt that he had harbored those very suspicions years earlier. That admission tipped the balance. At dawn on May 16th, 1861, officers marched into Ravenscroft Manor. They found Margaret seated in her drawing room, sipping tea as though nothing in the world was amiss. When confronted with the charges, she lifted her chin and denied everything, her poise so flawless that some onlookers felt a pang of doubt. But the search of the house crushed her performance. Arsenic was discovered everywhere in the kitchen, tucked inside tea canisters, hidden in her bedroom, even stitched into the lining of her favorite coat. With each discovery, her carefully built facade cracked until the calculating woman beneath was laid bare. Charles's downfall was slower, his soul unraveling in the solitude of a jail cell. His confession, written in shaky script and sealed away until after his death, would later horrify the public when discovered decades later. In it, he laid bare the truth of how Margaret had drawn him in. "I believed I was protecting Eleanor," he wrote. "Margaret convinced me that silence was the only way to keep Eleanor and Catherine safe. By the time I understood she intended to kill Eleanor regardless, I was too deep in her web to escape. I tell myself I might have found the courage to resist. But in my darkest moments, I know that cowardice and desire made me her willing accomplice." The trial of Margaret Aldridge rocked Rhode Island to its core. Newport's polished society, the gilded circle that had once celebrated her as a formidable widow, now whispered in horror about the woman who had poisoned her way to power and fortune. The scandal's shattered reputations exposed the rot behind marble walls and left a stain on Bellevue Avenue that would never fully fade. The scandal consumed New England. Newspapers ran every detail in lurid headlines, painting Margaret Aldridge as both monster and tragic widow. Reporters fixated on her icy composure in court, noting how she never shed a tear, even as her own daughters testified against her. Eleanor and Catherine described their father's final illness, Thomas Richardson's suspicions, and their own narrow escape from Ravenscroft Manor. Their testimony, dramatic and heart-wrenching, drew packed crowds to the courthouse. Margaret, for her part, never wavered in her denials. She insisted she was the victim of a conspiracy spun by resentful daughters eager for her fortune, and by prosecutors hungry for glory. She claimed Edmund's death had been nothing more than an unfortunate accident. Thomas's demise a tragic mishap with horses, and every scrap of evidence a fabrication meant to strip her of dignity and wealth. But the tide of evidence was impossible to ignore. Arsenic turned up everywhere in Edmund's exhumed remains, in Thomas Richardson's body, and even in Eleanor's blood, which showed she had been slowly poisoned in the weeks leading up to her escape. Charles Whitfield's fate was sealed alongside hers. Though his role was painted as that of a weak young man ensnared by Margaret's influence, the court still found him guilty. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He served 12 before dying of consumption behind bars. His final letter, written to Eleanor shortly before his death, begged her forgiveness and admitted that his cowardice had nearly destroyed her. "I believed I was protecting you," he confessed. "In truth, I was protecting only myself." Margaret Aldridge was sentenced to hang a rare punishment for a woman in Rhode Island at the time. On October 13th, 1862, she walked to the gallows with her head high, wearing black silk and betraying no emotion other than mild annoyance at the restless crowd. Even at the end, she proclaimed her innocence, declaring herself a victim of lies. The trapdoor fell, and with it ended one of the most notorious trials of the 19th century. The Aldridge fortune greatly diminished by court costs, and restitution passed to Eleanor and Catherine. Neither wanted anything more to do with Newport. They sold Ravenscroft Manor and moved west to California, determined to rebuild their lives far from the shadow of their mother's crimes. Eleanor never married. Haunted by her past, she devoted her life to helping women escape abusive marriages, pouring her energy into charity work and reform. Catherine wed a physician and raised 4 children. But she carried the scars in silence, never again speaking publicly of what happened at Ravenscroft. The manor itself sat abandoned for nearly 2 decades, its marble walls empty and silent until it was finally sold to a wealthy Boston shipping family. They demolished it entirely, unwilling to live in a house that had become synonymous with death and scandal. In its place, they built something new, determined to erase any memory of the darkness that had once thrived there. Local legend whispered that Ravenscroft Manor had been cursed, but the reality was simpler and darker. No family wanted to inherit the shadow of Margaret Aldridge's crimes. The story of Margaret unsettles us not just because of what she did, but because of what it suggests. In an era when women were thought incapable of calculated violence, how many others might have slipped through unnoticed? How many devoted wives or loving mothers quietly concealed arsenic bottles in their medicine cabinets, hiding behind society's belief in their innocence? So what do you think? Was Margaret a desperate woman, backed into a corner by financial ruin and social pressure? Or was she always a cold-blooded predator who exploited the world's assumptions about femininity to mask her true nature? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this tale of betrayal and hidden murder gripped you, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss the next investigation into history's darkest secrets. Share this story with a fellow true crime enthusiast, because no matter how disturbing, these truths deserve to be told. For over 60 years, the real scope of Margaret's crimes lay buried, known only to the families who lived through it and the legal officials who locked away the records. It wasn't until renovations in 1924 unearthed those hidden documents. Charles Whitfield's confession, Thomas Richardson's notes, that historians began to stitch together the nightmare in full. Even today, the body count remains uncertain. Were there other men whose deaths never made the record books? Other accidents that were in fact carefully staged? And the most chilling question of all, how many other Margaret Aldridges haunted the drawing rooms of Victorian America, their arsenic vials tucked neatly inside velvet purses, their faces a mask of respectability, while they plotted death at the family table? We may never know, but her story reminds us that evil does not always wear the face of the stranger in the dark. Sometimes it sits across from us at dinner, smiling sweetly, waiting for the moment to strike.